I feel I've made it quite clear by now that I'm a big fan of the Little Nightmares franchise. You probably know what that is, but if you're new here and don't, then let me bring you up to speed. Little Nightmares is a game series about children trying to survive in monster-infested worlds, having to use their wits to overcome their enormous opponents as they do everything they can to just make sure they're still breathing by the end of the day. It's basically an evolution of Playdead's Limbo, and it remains one of my favourite game series because I happen to really enjoy the things it does and the way it does them. I adore the bleak atmosphere and often genuinely unnerving monster designs, which are mostly just people with wrong proportions and drooping skin, but I can't deny it's effective for making me feel really uncomfortable. The teacher from Little Nightmares 2 is my personal vote for the best monster because everything about her is just so off-putting. From her aforementioned unusual proportions to her glassy eyes to the way she loudly clomps around the room looking for her prey, but especially her extending neck that almost makes me feel sickly and anxious, and I absolutely love it. There are even some comics, and the first game has a good chunk of DLC which added swimming and changed the lighter we had to a flashlight, which affected how we illuminated the environment we were exploring. When I first heard there was a mobile spin-off, I was hesitant to try it because I struggled to see mobile gaming in any sort of positive way even now, not that the industry does much to help itself. Last week we even looked at one of the worst examples of mobile gaming that I've seen in a few years, and even without considering it, most mobile games are just basic bitch puzzles which can't help but interrupt you every stage to cram another ad down your throat. I've said before that I'm okay with ads and monetization in free games, but there is a limit before they start taking the piss. Sorry, I didn't mean last week, I meant 2 weeks ago. I forgot that I don't do this weekly anymore. Eventually I gave in and bought it because the Little Nightmares fangirl in me won out over the adult that I'm supposed to be, and I have to say I wasn't disappointed. In fact, I might even say that Very Little Nightmares is currently my favourite mobile game. So let's have a look and see what's going on here. Very Little Nightmares abandons the perspective of the previous two games for a fixed isometric approach and also brings with it a new art style, which I admit were two things that took some getting used to. The game is also played entirely in the portrait perspective, which is something else that took an adjustment, and yep, I'm afraid most of the video will look like this. I am sorry, I checked the settings, you can't change it. I believe the game's fixed perspective and art style are both implemented to better suit the mobile device that they'll be played on, and honestly I don't have an issue with either. The art style still maintains elements of the previous. For example, the kids are still incredibly small and everything in the environment around them is huge and imposing. In fact, most of the stylistic choices in the previous games is still present, just in 2D and with a more hand-drawn look to them. In essence, it still feels like a Little Nightmares world, and more importantly, the new chosen art style and perspective both serve to highlight the level of work and care that went into crafting this game. It's not just a half-baked slapdash mobile tie-in, it's something that the team clearly worked very hard on. The ways the game adjusts itself for the mobile device it will be played on were well implemented, and it didn't take long to get used to. As with the main games, Very Little Nightmares is primarily a puzzle game. We don't so much control the kid here, rather we tap on a section of floor that we want them to move to, and if there happens to be an interactable thing near there, then we tap on it to interact with it. Sounds very basic, but continuing the theme of the development team working hard to make something good, they made sure that the puzzles were well designed to accommodate for the limited interaction without being so simple that the player doesn't even have to try. It's very easy to get dead in this game. I even got an achievement for it. Twice. Yes, I'm very good at fucking things up, you know. The puzzles are well conceived and often require a combination of smarts and patience to be able to solve. You can't just tap on the screen and leave the kid to do the rest. You better believe you need to be ready to run when the monster you just trolled is out for your blood. A good example is this bit here where we use chandeliers to cross a room. You can't just tap and leave the kid to it, you need to time it out and be quite precise or you'll fall to your death. Or this running away bit here where you have to be careful about where you move or the telekinetic butler will squash you with these statues. It probably would have been so easy to just have the game be one where you tap the screen and then let it play itself as you go off to bring the laundry in, but no, the developers designed the obstacles and the interface in such a way that even though your means of interaction are limited, they are still engaging. You have to make sure that when you're tapping the screen to move, you're not about to move over a section of floor that will collapse, and you need to be quick enough to respond when parts of the environment break around you as you proceed. You can tap once to walk and twice to run, and sometimes the latter is the worst choice because in your rush you might miss a path that you need to go down, or you'll alert a nearby monster to your presence before it is safe to do so. Timing is a big part of the game. In fact, of all the Little Nightmares games, Very Little Nightmares probably has my vote for some of the best puzzle design, and that's impressive to me because, again, I can only imagine there were some irritating limits to have to work within for a mobile device, and I'm only more impressed that the gameplay is as solid as it is. This is a game that I was quite happy to play, not just whilst pooping, because mobile games, but I was very happy to shut off the TV, lay in my bed and play without needing any external distraction of any sort because the game was interesting enough on its own. Obviously, I am a Little Nightmares fan and I accept that I am biased here, but I think if we removed the connection and called it, I don't know, Little Fucker Lost in Monster House, I'd still have had a great time playing this. There are some issues. Sometimes when loading in, for example, the game would have skipped a previous section that I had not yet completed. Don't worry, I went back and played a bit anyway because I wanted to. And I've had a few taps fail to register properly. Also, Also, I should bring up the price here. It costs about $6.99, which isn't hugely expensive, but for a game that has maybe an hour and 15 minutes worth of stuff in it, it's a bit of an ask on the surface. I think it's worth it though. After all, game length isn't the only metric we should use to judge a game's value. Heck, that Bright Memory Infinite game I played a while ago has like 2 hours of game in it at most, and yet managed to be one of my favourite games of last year because it was a lot of fun. Very Little Nightmares was still entertaining to play, and even though it's brighter and more colourful than its console siblings, it still manages to be unnerving at times. You never know what's going to try and kill you next. The environments are richly detailed, and I also want to say that the sound design also manages to achieve that Little Nightmares feel of being mostly subtle and unnerving, with every sound that we as a player make being slightly too loud in that horror game way that breeds the concern that something big and nasty might hear us with every step we take. I really like the gameplay and presentation here. As I said, your own ability to interact with the world is limited, but the game has been well designed for its intended medium and opts to embrace the limitation, designing its puzzles and encounters around it. The game knows what it wants to be and how it needs to go about being that thing. Aside from that occasional response issue and that weird loading screen thing I mentioned earlier, I haven't really got any complaints about the gameplay. It does what it needs to do, and I always found it engaging. Yeah, I really like it because, again, it works within the limitations and in fact embraces them to produce what is a very tight experience. See, mobile games don't have to suck. Now, this part was always going to be a cunt to do, because Little Nightmares as a franchise bathes itself in ambiguity and suggestion, letting the environments and monster designs tell the story without ever speaking a word to the player. Very Little Nightmares is no different. There is no dialogue in the game. The most we have is kids occasionally screaming or the monsters making their monster noises. If you play the game, the most you'll have to go on is that you're a kid in a raincoat stuck in a house full of monsters, and the goal is to get to a place that is not a house full of monsters. Not exactly a story for the ages, and really the plot only comes together if you dig. Let me say right now that I don't blame anyone for not wanting to dig around in the game's wiki or forums to piece together the narrative, because I cannot hold anything against someone who doesn't want to spend their day doing homework for a video game, because after all it is just a video game. Still, if you do dig into it, you'll likely come to the conclusion that this house, known as the Nest, is a facility that grooms a powerful family of monsters, with it having ties to the Moor from the first game. The first enemy we encounter is the craftsman, who seems to be making dolls and is bound to a wheelchair. The second is the butler, with his arms locked behind his back, who uses telekinesis to do chores and tend to the house. Last but not least is the pretender, who has some very similar powers to the lady from the first game, being able to absorb the life force of her prey and whatnot, but unlike the lady, she is a child and seems to need to directly touch us to do so, suggesting that her powers are still developing. My takeaway is that the Nest is exactly that. It's a nest where the next leader of the Moor is groomed to one day succeed the lady. There is also a hint at some classism, with some monsters being relegated to service roles, and in this game's case, them being physically trapped where they are. There is quite a lot to dig into here. To me, this is one of the game's great strengths, feeling confident enough in what it presents to know that its players will be asking questions and piecing the story together on their own, but like I said earlier, I 100% respect that this kind of ambiguity can be really fucking annoying to some people who just want to know what the fuck's going on. Ambiguity in storytelling is a double-edged sword, of course. You'll have on one side the dedicated fans who like not being told everything because they love piecing together the narrative at their own pace and debating what some of the elements really mean. On the other side, you'll have people who just want to know what's going on, who find this sort of approach really frustrating, or who might even argue that the lack of direct narrative is a result of a team who had no story to tell. A lot of the time it will mostly come down to personal preference, and I honestly don't mind how a storyteller wants to deliver their plot, so long as the execution is solid, and I say Little Nightmares as a series does it right. It does ambiguity well. The downside to Very Little Nightmares is that it's just that. It's very little. It's Spool, a short game that you could probably beat comfortably in a single sitting, but I believe that the game's ability to play to its strengths more than make up for the limited playtime. After all, I said earlier that length isn't the only metric we should judge a game by. The things we do in the time are, to me, more important than the amount of time we spend doing them. Good games are good regardless of their length. Whilst this can be a factor, I argue it should never be the only factor that matters. An example I can think of right now would be something like A Hat in Time. It's not an overly long long game, but it makes sure that what it does in the time that it has is fun and engaging enough to keep a player wanting to come back with real effort put in to make it as entertaining as possible. Or again, Bright Memory Infinite that only sticks around for a couple of hours, but it's a fun couple of hours with some over-the-top shooting that might have even suffered if the game was longer, because as the old saying goes, the candle that burns twice as bright burns half as long. So overall, I do like Very Little Nightmares quite a lot. This is how you do a good mobile tie-in game. It would have been easy to just pump out a samey puzzle game with Little Nightmares wallpaper on it and stuff it with microtransactions, and I'm glad that the developers didn't do that. No, they made a real game and made it feel true to the larger franchise to which it belongs. If you're a Little Nightmares fan and have missed it until now, I recommend giving it a go. Hell, if you're not a Little Nightmares fan, it's still a solid game that deserves some love. It's a shame that I don't really have anything left to say. You can find some secrets, they're these little jack-in-the-box things that are based on monsters and characters from the series, but the game doesn't really do anything more than what it needs to do, but to be honest, that's fine. That's good. So yeah, that's Very Little Nightmares, a good mobile game. We're done. Love you all, and see you later. Oh, like and subscribe, by the way. Also, check out my T-Mail shop. I've got more stuff on there now, so yeah, do that. Bye.